Hello and welcome everybody back to Between the Hashes, our weekly college football primer. Coming to you once again from Los Angeles, California. I'm Matt Keim, your host. And before I get any further into the video, remember to subscribe for more great content on college football, on the Washington Commanders with the John Keim Report, and much more here at Ampire Media on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. We had quite a doozy of it last week. We had the best game of the year so far with the Red River game with Oklahoma and Texas, plus a number of surprising results. So 7 teams lost to either unranked or lower-ranked teams, and a number of others, like USC, for example, were pushed to the brink. And even teams that won comfortably on paper, Ohio State, for example, had some early struggles. They were down 10-0 midway through the second at one point. Around the league, Alabama reasserted its control over the SEC West with a dramatic win over Texas A&M, but other portions of the top 10 were actually off this past week. They were actually off this week getting ready for one of the biggest games all year. I'm talking about Oregon and Washington, today's headliner game. I'm going to use that to segue into talking about the Pac-12 for a few minutes before I unveil this week's top 10. The Pac-12, it's almost like a Greek-style tragedy where they're at their high point before they're brought down to absolute nothingness through their fatal flaw of hubris. Oh man, the Pac-12. It really is a shame what's happening to them, and the demise of the Pac-12 is a little bit different than what's going on with like Oklahoma and Texas leaving the Big 12. The Pac-12 kind of put themselves in this position through bad management, bad decision-making, launching the Pac-12 network, but like having no major networks connected to it, so it's really, really hard to find or get packages on. You're having high-stakes ranked matchups happening on Thursday and Friday nights. You're having high-stakes ranked matchups happening on Saturday, 8 p.m. kickoff Pacific time. I live on the West Coast now, so it doesn't bother me, but when I was living on the East Coast, there was no friggin' way I was staying up to 11:30 at night on a Saturday night trying to see some of these games. It's just like, because with a 2 or 3 or even sometimes 4 in the morning end time based on how late the game goes, it was just bad business. You couple that with USC, the flagship program of the conference, having a really, really bad stretch basically since Pete Carroll left. He was forced out, and you have the flagship program foundering at a time where it desperately needed to carry the load. And then you have the situation we have now where everybody is scattered to the wind, and now only 2 are left with Oregon State and Washington State. And the shame about it is that regardless of the off-the-field maneuvering, the on-the-field product has never been better. I don't think it's a stretch to say that the Pac-12 through the first half of the season has been far and away the best conference. The SEC has realistically 2 teams that may be at a playoff-ish level. Georgia definitely, and Bama maybe. Everybody else is on a sliding scale of decent to mediocre. With the Pac-12, you have this wide range of teams, and you have the best collection of quarterback talent in the entire country. If you don't believe me, look at this. Through the first half of the season, so I'm making this video Thursday, October 12th. Top 3 favorites in terms of Heisman odds are Michael Penix, Bo Nix, and Caleb Williams. All 3 of whom are quarterbacks for Pac-12 programs. You have a fourth, Cameron Ward, the Washington State quarterback. He was top 10 before the UCLA loss, but even now he's still like top 20 in those odds. And then you have Shedeur Sanders, who's getting talked about as a first-round talent. And so you have 5 really good quarterbacks, and then you take UCLA's quarterback, true freshman Dante Moore, who has been really, really good. He has an interception problem, but that there's a lot of like true freshman growing pains with him, but he's still been proving to be a solid quarterback for them. With the release of NIL, you have this massive amount of transfers, and so 4 of the 5 quarterbacks I just named, all transfers from elsewhere. USC and Colorado were built primarily off of transfers. Oregon, Bo Nix was very infamously the Auburn quarterback for a long time and was very up and down before turning it on at Oregon. Michael Penix at Washington, he was Indiana's quarterback for a long time, but before going to Washington to reunite with his former offensive coordinator in Kalen DeBoer. And so you have this massive influx of talent, partially because of NIL and partially because the NCAA has really relaxed transferring rules. And so you have this situation where the Pac-12 can make up some of these talent gaps where they weren't able to as much in the past. The end result is that you have like 6 or 7 teams that are ranked in the top 25, 4 ranked in the top 15, 3 in the top 10. At one point, it was getting talked about in certain circles that if there was a conference where 2 teams should make it this year, maybe we should look at the Pac-12. So, like, for example, let's say Washington wins in a close game, but loses to Oregon in the Pac-12 championship game, and there are only 2 losses to each other. So you have one at 12-1, the other at 11-1. Both with wins over USC, over Washington State, over UCLA, and all that, and Colorado and all the others. So the argument is there. Basically, what I'm saying is that this is going to be a hell of a requiem season for the Pac-12, so we all have to keep watching. With that out of the way, let's get to my top 10 list. Number 10, Alabama. While I still don't think this Alabama team is nearly on the level of some of those previous Alabama teams that Nick Saban's trotted out, with their win over Texas A&M, they showed they're still very much in control of the SEC West. That conference will probably once again come down to Alabama and Georgia in December. Number 9, Texas. I kind of hate to have them this low because I stand by everything I said on them last week. Them losing a thriller to an undefeated Oklahoma team that has turned out to be way better than projected, I don't think should be held too much against them. That said, there's still a lot of teams that haven't lost yet. But Texas is still very much in the mix of things. That win over Alabama is the best win in the country, and they will probably rematch with Oklahoma in December for a chance at the playoff. Number 8, Florida State. I still think Florida State has a pretty good resume with their LSU and Clemson wins. They've looked so up and down that it's a little bit hard to rate them over some of the teams ahead of them that have been a little bit more consistent. Now, some of that might be a competition thing, but I don't know. One of those up and down games was Boston College. Florida, the good news for them is that they very much control their own destiny. Number 7, Washington. Washington was off this past weekend, so they got to escape some of the mayhem that was going around. Where they remain on my top 10 rankings is going to heavily depend on what happens on Saturday. That said, Michael Penix Jr. has been a revelation. That man is that football team. He's been amazing to watch. Kalen DeBoer, the 2 of them go work really, really well together, and I'm excited to see what happens with them this weekend. Number 6, Penn State. They too had the bye week, so they escaped the chaos. I think they're playing UMass this weekend, and they're favored by like 42.5, which honestly, they should be able to cover. We'll know way more about Penn State next week when they play Ohio State, which will be next week's headliner game. So more on them in a few days. Number 5. Oregon. I think they just look like the more complete team. They're really good offensively. They're balanced offensively. Their defense looks solid, looks aggressive. So far, they have one of the best defensive performances of the year with their win over Colorado. And while I think Colorado, the hype was completely out of control and Colorado was very much overrated, they still held them to only 6 points, and nobody else has done that. Number 4, Oklahoma. I think we all owe Brent Venables an apology. He got way too much hate for trying to manage the mess that Lincoln Riley left on the latter's exit. Dylan Gabriel played fantastic. He outplayed Quinn Ewers, and even though you might think that Texas inherently still has the more talented roster, they played a hell of a game. They very much earned their spot up here. They have proven that they belong at that top level. Number 3, Ohio State. Ohio State still continues to look kind of shaky on the offensive line. The 20-point win over Maryland was a little bit deceptive given how kind of slow they started. But you know what? If I'm going to put Georgia ahead of them, despite Georgia having to come back from double digits multiple times against bad teams this year, Ohio State gets a pass for the same thing. That said, if they don't fix those offensive issues now, they will be in for a rough time next week. Number 2, Michigan. Nothing's changed for me with Michigan. They still have one of the most talented, most experienced rosters in the college. J.J. McCarthy looks as good as ever. They kicked the crap out of a decent Minnesota team, and I just don't have a lot to say about Michigan this week. They look solid. They haven't done anything to move up or down, and they're probably going to be right here right up until they play Penn State. Number 1, Georgia. Okay, so you heard me doubting Georgia this time last week. I stand by my criticisms on Georgia. I still think them being outplayed at home and being down double digits at home against a bad South Carolina team should be overlooked. I think it's a little bit like Ohio State, where they replaced a ton of guys who were key contributors on a national championship team last year, and that sort of thing just takes time to gel. And so in comes Kentucky, who I hailed as one of the, if not the best team on their schedule before the SEC championship game, and they absolutely take control of that game from opening kickoff and just destroy them. I think that's a really, really impressive performance from them. If they're proving that they can still turn it on and wake up against a ranked team, because I still think Kentucky's solidly a top 25 team, they have won something like 23 or 24 straight games now, so I think that kind of speaks for itself. So Georgia stays at number 1. There you have it, my top 10. Let's go to the lightning round. USC goes to South Bend to take on Notre Dame, who is finishing up a brutal stretch of playing 3 ranked teams. They've lost 2 out of those 3 games, one of which was on the last play of the game, and the other of which was a blowout. I think in college, especially with college kids, there's definitely scheduling losses the way, like, in the NBA, you have like a team losing the second game of a back-to-back on the road. That's almost always a guaranteed loss in the NBA. I think there might be something to that, and it's why everybody thought they would lose to Duke. It just turns out that that loss happened a week later. I don't say that to downplay Louisville. Louisville played a hell of a game, and it's why they're a top 15, borderline top 10 team. I still think Notre Dame's a pretty solid team. Are they playoff caliber? No. I think that's been shown. But at the same time, there's a couple advantages for them in this game. The number one being this game is at home. Number two, they have much better line play on both sides of the ball than USC does. USC is dealing with some injuries to key playmakers outside of Caleb Williams, and that might come back to haunt them against a good defense. USC's defense might very much betray them. And the other thing is that the projected weather conditions for this game just look abysmal. Raining all night, 25-mile-an-hour winds. And so some of the best advantages that USC would have on Notre Dame, either at home or on a neutral field, might be kind of taken out of play because you can't throw the ball nearly to the degree that you would want to. And I think Notre Dame should actually be able to control the game, both with its running game and the line of scrimmage. So it wouldn't shock me if we saw kind of a low-scoring game that kind of mirrored the Ohio State game from last month. The line currently actually sits Notre Dame -3. I like the points here. Number 2, Miami at UNC. This should have been an undefeated matchup, but oh my God, Miami made a classic all-time coaching blunder, and it backfired in the worst way possible. So I think that kind of like takes the shine off of a Miami team that's actually been playing really well. Tyler Van Dyke is like one of the top-rated quarterbacks in the country currently. The problem is that this game is in Chapel Hill, and it is projected to rain. I think North Carolina is starting to get some national attention as a real contender in the ACC. I think this game is just going to go to solidify. UNC is favored by 3.5 because the game's at home. I like North Carolina. I like the points. Okay, so the bane of my picks have been the Pac-12, so let's go back to the Pac-12. UCLA at Oregon State. Oregon State is favored by 3.5. UCLA has actually shown to be a very pleasant surprise this year, as has the rest of the Pac-12. My big question with Moore, the quarterback over at UCLA, he's been a little turnover happy. He's like close to a 2-to-1 TD interception ratio. Oregon State's probably one of the better defenses he'll go against, and the last time he played against a decent defense, they scored 7 points. So I kind of like Oregon State, especially because they're at home. Oregon State's favored by 3.5. I'm going Oregon State. I'm going the points. All right, last one. In the battle of the two teams that completely destroyed my predictions last week, Missouri versus Kentucky, both coming off of disappointing double-digit losses. You know, regardless, there's 2 ways to read what happened with Kentucky last week. You can say that Kentucky was just completely overrated, or you can say that Georgia just woke up and reminded everybody why they're Georgia. I think the latter is a little bit more likely, so I still believe in Kentucky. I like their run game. I like their defense. I like that this game's at home, and I think Kentucky should, especially at home, be able to dictate the pace of the game on the line of scrimmage. So I go Kentucky, I go the points. It's only a 2-point line, so I'm gonna roll with it. And that brings us to our headliner game. One of the games I've been looking all year to talking about, right up there with Red River or Ohio State, Michigan, or Alabama, Texas. This is at that level in terms of the stakes that we're talking about here. Oregon versus Washington. Currently, Washington is favored at home by 3. So the interesting thing is that this might be the highest stakes edition of this rivalry in decades, if not ever, just because both teams are legitimate national title contenders. Both teams have quarterbacks that are in the top 3 in terms of Heisman projections so far. And so whoever wins this game is going to have an inside track to the Heisman, to the playoffs, to the Pac-12 championship game. And the similarities go beyond that. You have second-year head coaches, Kalen DeBoer at Washington, Dan Lanning at Oregon. You have transfers from elsewhere, Bo Nix and Michael Penix. While Oregon wasn't bad under Mario Cristobal, they still went to and won a Rose Bowl. You could make the argument that they weren't making full use of their talent under him either. Despite a really bad first game against a murderous Georgia team, they've been, ever since that Georgia loss to begin the year last year, they've been one of the best teams in the country. With Washington, you have a team that, like, after a disastrous 1.5 years under Jimmy Lake, you needed someone to right the ship, and Kalen DeBoer has more than done that. They've been doing it with transfers, especially with the propagation of NIL, been a little bit more successful with that. Both teams are going to the Big Ten next year, along with the LA schools. And so there's a lot of similarities here. This should honestly be a really high-scoring game. If you're gonna gamble on this game, by the way, I would take the over. So let's look at some of these stats. Washington, they are first overall in passing yards per game. They score 46 6 points per game. They average over 8 yards a play, give up just over 5 yards per play on defense. Penix has thrown for just about 2,000 yards in the air so far, 16 touchdowns, 2 picks. On the other side, offensively, you have Oregon also scoring at 44.3 points per game. They too average over 8 yards a play. So both teams are getting almost a whole first down every time they snap the ball. They're 11th pass yard per game. Penix has thrown for just shy of 1,500 yards in the air, 15 touchdowns, 1 pick. I'd say part of the discrepancy in the Penix and Michael Penix numbers is that Washington's offense is a lot more dependent on the court on Penix. Oregon is a lot better running the ball on the ground. So listen to this. One team is 92nd in rushing yards per game, and Oregon is significantly better than that. They are 22nd in rush yards per game. Oregon is also giving up 1 less yard per play on defense, where Washington is giving 5.07 yards per play on defense, and Oregon is giving up 4.02 yards per play on defense. Might be one of the more deciding factors. Part of the problem with Washington is that the first team with a pulse they played was Arizona. And it's not like Arizona are some world beaters. They're decent, but they're not amazing. And so they were getting national champion conversations weeks ago when they like going into that Arizona game. They had the 94th ranked strength of schedule, and it's just really, really hard for me to take a team seriously if they're not playing anybody. They've been doing what they need to have been doing against bad teams, but the first decent team they played was a really close game. Oregon, however, Oregon's best win probably up to this point is Colorado, and like I said, I think Colorado was kind of overrated based on a deceptively bad schedule to begin the year. But you know what? Oregon too has done what it's needed to do. I also think that holding Colorado to 6 points is the most impressive data point between the two teams. That's probably why Oregon is rated so much higher on the defensive side of the ball currently, is because they have that game. To further continue the similarities, both teams are coming out of the bye on this game, so they're both fresh, they're both rested, they're both ready to go. This honestly is going to be a really, really fun game. Causes for concern. Part of why I'm harping on Oregon's defensive standpoint so much is that if you limit what Michael Penix can do with his legs or throwing the ball, what I would like to see from Washington is there another way you can win? So, like, if we go back to the Ohio State, like, going back to Ohio State, Notre Dame took control of the pace of that game and kind of dictated how the game went. If Oregon is able to do that, how can Washington respond is my biggest question with Washington. The rushing numbers are significantly better for Oregon than they are for Washington, and so if there's adverse conditions in the weather or adverse conditions with the crowd, they can probably more reliably run on their run game to kind of establish a rhythm than Washington can. Now, Washington is favored. They are at home. But the rule of thumb with odds makers is that you typically give about 3 points to the home team. And so this is still about a dead even game as far as that's concerned. If you look at their overall defense, they still boast top 25 defenses. Washington is 22nd in scoring defense. Oregon is 10th in scoring defense. Washington has some very, very definitive offensive strengths through the air and with like giant explosive outside plays. Washington has an amazing tandem of receivers. So the big question for Oregon is contain the edge would be the biggest key for Oregon. Biggest key for Washington is set the tone early with the line of scrimmage. These games just get harder and harder to predict each week, and that's why this show's so much fun. And so I think I'm gonna roll with the Oregon Ducks to win on the road here. I've been talking them up all season. I think this is probably the best Oregon team since at least the Marcus Mariota team that went to the national championship in the first year of the playoff. I truly think they're that good. Honestly, a win from either team really wouldn't surprise me. I just think Oregon is a little bit more sound on defense and in the line of scrimmage, and because of that, I kind of like Oregon here. And because Washington's favored, so I guess Oregon covers and wins. So that's all I have for you guys this week. Thank you for sticking with me to the end. Hopefully my picks turn out a little bit better this week than the last couple of weeks. I really need to turn it around. And remember, tune in later for John's keys and predictions against for the Commanders against the Atlanta Falcons. You can find the John Keim Report here on YouTube on Ampire Media, either on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, and I'll see you next week.